This is MTG Burgeoning, and in this video we are going to showcase the quintessential cards needed to build the core of a mono-red burn EDH deck with Ojer Ixonil, Deepest Might, as the general. Ojer Ixonil, Deepest Might, debuted in the Lost Caverns of Ixalan and is a 4/4 god with trample for 2 and 2 red mana. If a red source we control would deal an amount of non-combat damage less than Ojer Ixonil's power to an opponent, that source deals damage equal to Ojer Ixonil's power instead. As a 4/4, for now, our general is going to boost any red non-combat damage that we deal to our opponents to 4 points of damage each time. The core of this build is inundated with direct damage spells and abilities for the purposes of maximizing Ojer Ixonil's direct damage dealing ability. With such a potent and attention-grabbing triggered ability sitting in our command zone, we can expect our general to be a lightning rod for attention once it hits our side of the battlefield. However, our commander has a death trigger that acts as a barrier to removing it from the battlefield. When Ojer Ixonil dies, we return it to the battlefield under our control tapped and transformed into Temple of Power. Temple of Power can tap to add 1 red mana to our mana pool, or we can pay 2 red mana and tap it to transform it back into Ojer Ixonil. We can only activate this ability if red sources we control dealt at least 4 points of non-combat damage this turn, and only as a sorcery. Here we have a general that enhances direct damage in the color known for dealing direct damage. Ojer Ixonil's ability powerfully synergizes with specific types of burn builds, and its added layer of protection through its transforming death trigger grants it greater staying power on the battlefield. Through this dynamic, we will burn through our opponent's life totals on the path to imminent victory. Let's begin filling the core of this build with some permanent spells that deal direct damage to each of our opponents. We can tap Unruly Catapult and Thermo Alchemist to deal 1 damage to each opponent, and whenever we cast an instant or sorcery spell, we untap them. Lightning Rig Crew and Brimstone Trebuchet follow suit, except the crew untaps whenever we cast a pirate spell, and the Trebuchet untaps whenever a knight enters the battlefield under our control. Whenever we cast an instant or sorcery spell, Electrostatic Field and Erebor Flamesmith deal 1 damage to each opponent. Kessig Flame Breather and Firebrand Archer do the same, except they are triggered whenever we cast a non-creature spell, and not just instants and sorceries. Speaking of non-creature spells, whenever we cast one, we put an oil counter onto Sawblade Scamp. We can tap this Phyrexian beast and remove an oil counter from it to deal 1 point of damage to each opponent. Lobber Crew does the same, and we can untap it whenever we cast a multicolor spell, which may be a challenge since this is a monocolor build. We have direct damage sources that are triggered by permanents entering the battlefield under our control as well. Through their landfall abilities, whenever a land enters the battlefield under our control, both Tunneling Geopede and Spitfire Lagak deal 1 damage to each opponent. Whenever another creature enters the battlefield under our control, Witty Roastmaster deals 1 damage to each opponent, and so does Impact Tremors. We have a couple of other permanent types that fit into this burn theme splendidly. We can pay 2 red mana and tap Shivan Gorge to deal 1 damage to each opponent. Chandra Awakened Inferno has a +2 loyalty ability that gives each opponent an emblem that deals 1 damage to that opponent at the beginning of their upkeep. At this time, there are no ways to interact with emblems, and if our opponents are gifted multiple emblems from this version of Chandra during the game, and our general is alongside her on the battlefield, then the game should end quite quickly. Chandra also has abilities that deal 3 damage to each non-elemental creature, and X damage to target creature or planeswalker. If that creature or planeswalker would die this turn, then it is exiled instead. Remember, as long as the non-combat damage from red sources we control deals damage less than Ojer Ixonil's power, then we reap the benefits of our general's damage accelerating trigger. So far, every source of direct damage showcased in this video deals exactly 1 point to each of our opponents. Although we have adopted an underlying deal 1 point of damage at a time theme in this build, we would be remiss if we failed to include a few permanent spells that deal more than 1 damage and synergize with our general's ability at the same time. When Fiery Inscription enters the battlefield, the ring tempts us. When the ring tempts us, we get an emblem named the ring if we do not already have one. Then our emblem gains the next ability, and we choose a creature to become or remain our ring bearer. The ring's abilities are granted from top to bottom, as the first ability has our ring bearer become legendary, and it cannot be blocked by creatures with greater power. Fiery Inscription is the only spell in the core of this build that synergizes with the ring. Its inclusion here is due to its second ability, and not its ring-tempting ability. Whenever we cast an instant or sorcery spell, this enchantment deals 2 damage to each opponent. Gutter Snipe follows suit, and these 2 cards continue our trend of dealing direct damage to each of our opponents. Continuing this trend is Purphoros, God of the Forge. Whenever another creature enters the battlefield under our control, he deals 2 damage to each opponent. This legendary god is indestructible, and as long as our devotion to red is less than 5, Purphoros is not a creature. To factor our devotion to red, we count the number of red mana symbols and the casting costs of permanents we control. Although a bit pricey, let's not overlook Purphoros' power-boosting activated ability, particularly when considering what our general can do. Closing out our use of permanents to deal direct damage to our opponents is Flame Fusillade, which is the first non-permanent card of this video. Until end of turn, Flame Fusillade gives permanents we control the ability to tap to deal 1 damage to any target. Although different than our aforementioned deal 1 point of damage at a time to each opponent mantra, with enough permanents on our side of the battlefield, we can consider this sorcery a win condition in this type of build. So far, we have filled the core of this build with permanents that deal direct damage to our opponents. Now let's shift our focus to some instant and sorcery spells that do the same. Tectonic Hazard deals 1 damage to each opponent and each creature our opponents control. And the Festivities follow suit, but it also deals 1 damage to each planeswalker our opponents control as well. Note that the damage dealt to our opponent's creatures and planeswalkers through these spells will not be accelerated by Ojer Ixonil's ability. Remember, our general's ability only triggers when our opponents are dealt non-combat damage from red sources we control, not creatures or planeswalkers. Our next smattering of cards still deal direct damage to our opponents, but they also deal direct damage to us. Well, we are running a mono-red EDH build here. It was only a matter of time until we felt the burn as well. Although the damage dealt to us is minimal, the damage dealt to our opponents will be much more impactful. Volcanic Spray deals 1 damage to each player and creature without flying. It can also be cast from our graveyard through its flashback cost, which is the same as its mana value. If we cast it this way, we exile it upon resolution. Rain of Embers does not discriminate. It deals 1 damage to each player and each creature. Although they have X in their mana values, we must resist the impulse to overinflate the value of X when casting Earthquake, Rolling Earthquake, and Delete. These spells deal X damage to each player. Earthquake deals X damage to each creature without flying, Rolling Earthquake deals X damage to each creature without horsemanship, and Delete deals X damage to each non-artifact creature. Paying 1 mana for X allows us to get the biggest bang for our direct damage dealing buck, secondary to our general's damage accelerating ability. We have some permanent spells that deal direct damage to each player as well. Spear Spewer taps to deal 1 damage to each player. Whenever another creature enters the battlefield, Rampaging Ferocidon deals 1 damage to that creature's controller. This dinosaur also prevents players from gaining life. It does not deal damage to each player simultaneously, but it can act as a deterrent for our opponent's desires to get creatures onto their sides of the battlefield. At the beginning of each player's upkeep, Roiling Vortex deals 1 damage to them. Whenever a player casts a spell, if no mana was spent to cast it, this enchantment deals 5 damage to that player. We can also pay a red mana to prevent our opponents from gaining life this turn. Whenever a player tapped a land for mana, Mana Barbs deals 1 damage to that player. Our opponents will have some tough choices to make if this enchantment is on our side of the battlefield alongside our general. At the beginning of the end step, if there are no creatures on the battlefield, then we sacrifice Pyrohemia. We can pay a red mana to have this enchantment deal 1 damage to each creature and each player. We can consider Pyrohemia a win condition in this build. Now let's begin filling the core of this build with some instant and sorcery spells that can trigger many of our aforementioned direct damage dealing abilities. For the purposes of keeping our burn engine revving, let's include spells that provide card advantage as well as mana acceleration. Faithless Looting has us draw 2 cards and discard 2 cards for just 1 mana. We can repeat this looting effect if we cast this spell from our graveyard for its flashback cost of 2 and 1 red mana. Cathartic Reunion has us discard 2 cards in order to draw 3 cards. Cathartic Pyre has 2 options from which to choose. We either deal 3 damage to target creature or planeswalker, or we discard up to 2 cards and then draw that many cards. As additional costs to cast Thrill of Possibility and Tormenting Voice, we discard a card, and then we draw 2 cards. Seize the Spoils does the same, except it also creates a treasure token, for which we can tap and sacrifice to add 1 mana of any color to our mana pool. Pirate's Pillage, Big Score, and Unexpected Windfall have us discard a card to draw 2 cards, and we create 2 treasure tokens instead of 1. We may discard a card when we cast Witch's Mark. If we do, then we draw 2 cards. We also create a Wicked Roll token attached to up to 1 target creature we control. If we already control another roll on it, then we put that one into the graveyard. Enchanted creature gets +1/+1, and when this aura is put into the graveyard, each opponent loses 1 life. Attaching this Wicked Roll token to our general increases the amount of direct damage dealt by its triggered ability, a feature that we will focus on later in this video. Now let's focus on maximizing the amount of damage we can deal to our opponents by boosting our general's power, a feature that we have foreshadowed throughout this video. Hero's Blade gives equipped creature +3/+2, and whenever a legendary creature enters the battlefield under our control, we may attach Hero's Blade to it. If this equipment is already on our side of the battlefield, when Ojer Ixonil comes into play, then we attach it to our general and avoid having to pay its equip cost of 4 generic mana. Blackblade Reforged gives equipped creature +1/+1 for each land we control, while Claws of Valakut and Granite Grip give enchanted creature +1/+0 for each mountain we control. Note that the equip cost for Blackblade Reforged is reduced from 7 generic mana to 3 if it equips a legendary creature. Also note that Claws of Valakut gives enchanted creature first strike in addition to its mountain-fueled power boost. For temporary power boosts with a side of card advantage, we have Dragon Mantle and Tavern Brawler. When Dragon Mantle comes into play, we draw a card. This aura gives enchanted creature fire breathing, which means for each 1 red mana we pay to activate it, enchanted creature gets +1/+0 until end of turn. Tavern Brawler gives commander creatures we own a beginning of our upkeep trigger that exiles the top card of our library. Our commander gets +X/+0 until end of turn, where X is that card's mana value. We may also play that card this turn. Hammer of Nazan, Champion's Helm, and Commander's Plate continue our power-boosting trend, while also providing a layer of protection for our attention-grabbing general. Hammer of Nazan gives equipped creature +2/+0 and indestructible, and whenever it or another equipment enters the battlefield under our control, we may attach that equipment to target creature we control. Champion's Helm gives equipped creature hexproof as long as it is legendary. Commander's Plate gives equipped creature +3/+3 and protection from each color that's not in our commander's color identity. It also has a reduced equip cost of 3 generic mana if we equip it to our general. Due to Commander's Plate giving Ojer Ixonil protection from white, blue, black, and green, numerous removal spells and abilities of our opponents cannot be used to target our general. Speaking of protection, although our general has some built-in staying power on the battlefield due to its transforming enabling death trigger, let's include some additional layers of security for the purposes of keeping Ojer Ixonil face up as much as possible throughout the game. Swiftfoot Boots gives equipped creature hexproof and haste, while Darksteel Plate and Mithril Coat give equipped creature indestructible. Note that Mithril Coat has flash, and when it enters the battlefield, we attach it to target legendary creature we control. Also note the absence of Shroud-enabling equipment like Lightning Greaves. Shroud prevents us from targeting the equipped creature as well, so the various equipment and auras previously showcased during this video cannot be attached to our general if Lightning Greaves is attached to it as well. Now let's close out this video with a smattering of cards that synergize with and enhance the theme of this build. If our general is equipped by Shadow Spear or Basilisk Collar, then we can gain obscene amounts of life. Shadow Spear gives equipped creature +1/+1 trample and lifelink, while Basilisk Collar gives it death touch and lifelink. Remember, the damage dealt by a source with lifelink does not have to be combat damage in order to gain life. Direct damage works as well. Note that Shadow Spear also has an activated ability that has permanents our opponents control lose hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. Neheb the Eternal has Afflict 3, which means that whenever it becomes blocked, defending player loses 3 life. Note that this is not non-combat damage and will not trigger our general's ability. Damage causes loss of life, but loss of life is not considered damage. Neheb's inclusion in the core of this build is due to its mana acceleration ability. At the beginning of our post-combat main phase, we add 1 red mana to our mana pool for each 1 life our opponents have lost this turn. In a dedicated burn build like this one, we should be able to produce oodles upon oodles of red mana, much to the chagrin of our opponents. Generally, in building around series videos like this one, we leave the land base in the hands of each individual deck brewer. However, we would be remiss if we failed to mention a strategic way to cultivate this build's land base. Since we're playing mono red, all signs point to mountain being the most featured land in our build. But it shouldn't. Instead of playing with mountains, we are going to play with snow-covered mountains instead. Why? Because when Extraplanar Lens comes into play, we exile target land we control. Whenever a land with the same name as the exiled land is tapped for mana, its controller adds 1 mana of any type that land produced. In any mono-colored deck, Extraplanar Lens can provide a massive boost in mana resources if utilized in this strategic way. It is far less likely that any of our opponents with red in their EDH decks are playing with snow-covered mountains instead of mountains. This way, we restrict the double mana producing lands to only snow-covered mountains, of which we have a plethora, and our opponents, most likely, will have none. As previously mentioned, Ojer Ixonil is a lightning rod for retention. Even with its death trigger and other already showcased forms of protection providing layer upon layer of security, we should have alternate game plans if our general becomes indisposed by languishing in the command zone due to overtaxation. The burn spells featured in this video may not be able to carry us to victory by themselves. Remember, they were selected to be complemented by Ojer Ixonil's ability. When this potential reality in mind, let's include a slew of other damage-accelerating permanents for the purposes of maintaining the vision of this build in the absence of our general. If a red source we control would deal damage to an opponent or a permanent an opponent controls, it deals an additional 2 damage thanks to Torbran, Thane of Redfell. If a source we control deals non-combat damage to an opponent or a permanent an opponent controls, Sulfim Mayhem Dominus has it deal double that damage to that player or permanent instead. We can also pay 1 generic mana and 2 red Phyrexian mana and discard 2 cards to put an indestructible counter onto Sulfim. We can pay for red Phyrexian mana by either paying a red mana or by paying 2 life. If our general is not present to do so, then we can accelerate the direct damage we deal with these 2 creatures. Two other damage accelerating options include Fiery Emancipation and City on Fire. If a source we control would deal damage to a permanent or a player, these enchantments deal triple that damage to that permanent or player instead. Note that City on Fire also has the Convoke mechanic, which means that our creatures can help us cast the spell. Each creature we tap while casting this spell pays for 1 generic mana or 1 mana of that creature's color. Also note that spells we cast that deal damage to each player will also triple the damage dealt to us through either of these cards. If our general is not present to do so, then we can accelerate the direct damage we deal with these two enchantments. However, what if our general is on our side of the battlefield alongside one of these damage accelerating options? Well, it's absolute turn the lights out and game over for our opponents, right? Well, this is where it gets a little tricky. These cards offer replacement effects similar to our generals, and if multiple replacement effects would change the way damage would be dealt to our opponents, then our opponents can choose to apply the replacement effects in a way that minimizes the damage. For example, let's say that we cast Reign of Embers, and we have Ojer Ixonil and Torbrand on our side of the battlefield. Our opponents are being dealt damage by and affected by Reign of Embers. Our opponents get to choose the order of Ojer Ixonil's and Torbrand's replacement effects, which modify the amount of damage that Reign of Embers deals to them. Either Torbrand adds 2 damage to the initial 1 damage for a total of 3 damage, which then has Ojer Ixonil increase the damage to 4, or the initial 1 damage is increased to 4 damage by Ojer Ixonil, and then Torbrand adds 2 damage for a total of 6 damage. 4 damage versus 6 damage, we should expect our opponents to choose 4 damage. As another example, let's say that we cast Reign of Embers, and we have Ojer Ixonil and Sulfim Mayhem Dominus on our side of the battlefield. Either Sulfim doubles the initial 1 damage to 2 damage, which then has Ojer Ixonil increase the damage to 4, or the initial 1 damage is increased to 4 damage by Ojer Ixonil, and then Sulfim doubles the damage for a total of 8 damage. 4 damage versus 8 damage, we should expect our opponents to choose 4 damage. For yet another example, let's say we cast Reign of Embers and we have Ojer Ixonil and either Fiery Emancipation or City on Fire on our side of the battlefield. Either Fiery Emancipation or City on Fire triples the initial 1 damage to 3 damage, which then has Ojer Ixonil increase the damage to 4, or the initial 1 damage is increased to 4 damage by Ojer Ixonil, and then Fiery Emancipation or City on Fire triples the damage for a total of 12 damage. 4 damage versus 12 damage. Once more, we should expect our opponents to choose 4 damage. The plan is to use these individual damage accelerating replacement effects as supplements to Ojer Ixonil's ability and not as complements. The inclusion of these cards helps to mitigate the potential loss of our general's direct damage ability by maintaining the accelerated burn theme of this build through these other sources. However, if we control 2 or more of these damage accelerating replacement effects alongside our general, then in this scenario, even the smallest amount of heat chosen by our opponents can burn them very, very badly. It then becomes a numbers game, and it is one that our opponents simply cannot win. Hopefully, we will have some opponents to win against in the future after playing against them with this build. This video provided a blueprint for building the core of a mono-red burn commander deck with Ojer Ixonil Deepest Might as the general. The cards showcased during this video are suggested options for crafting the thematic core of a mono-red burn EDH deck, in addition to providing ways of optimizing this theme. Removal spells, disruption, ramp, and the land base can vary from build to build, and also are dependent on metagame preferences and availability. In building around videos like this one, these deck components are left in the hands of each individual deck brewer. If you found this video appealing, then be sure to check out our other building around videos through the playlist on your screen. Also be sure to check out our other deck building series, and don't forget to let me know your thoughts about the core of this Ojer Ixonil build in the comment section below. This is MTG Burgeoning, your channel for all things Magic.